In this lesson, we'll talk about subdividing our geometry. So in ZBrush, sculpting is what we're going to be trying to do, right? And so to be able to do that, we want to have a model that has enough points to be able to move around. Let's take this cube, for example. The only way that we can modify the shape of this cube, we choose the Move brush, is at one of the points. And so I can move one of those points, but I can't really make a face on there. I can't do any sort of sculpting. And so what we do in ZBrush is we progressively subdivide our model so that we have enough polygons to work with. So let's take a look at how that works. So I've got polyframe, the polyframes turned on this cube, and we're going to go into the tool palette under geometry. So right below subtool, geometry, and here's a little button for dividing. And so Control D is the hotkey for that, but we're going to go ahead and just divide that. So two things have happened. The first thing is it's taken each one of those four-sided polygon faces and it's divided it into four more polygons. So if we take this slider up here at the top, you can toggle back and forth between the two levels. Okay, so here is our one face. So this is one face, and now on level 2, we've taken that one face and divided it into four faces, but that's not all that's happened. We've also smoothed the model. So it's gone in and taken the new points and it's smoothed it. Okay, so it's a little bit more like a sphere shape. And we have now two subdivision levels. So the bottom level in ZBrush is level 1, and then we have a second level, and we can go back and forth between those. If we subdivide again at level 2, so either hit divide or Control D again, now each one of those faces, so at level 2, taking a look at like this face, each one of those is subdivided into four new faces, and those are smoothed. So now we're getting closer to something where we can come in and have a little bit more control over it. So I could come in and change the shape of it in a much different way than I could when it was in a low-res state. Now we've got 3 subdivision levels, and you can see that changes have happened on the second subdivision level, even though I've done them at the third level. So these changes propagate through all of the levels, which is really cool. So if I smooth again, you can see we're up to 5 levels here now. Okay. And you can see that we've got all of those different polygons now. Now if I get kind of a smaller brush, I can move smaller parts of the model. Okay. Now as we do this, we can check and see what the poly count is. So our poly count right now is 1,500 polys right there. If we move up and down, so if we hit Shift D, that'll take us to the lower levels. For instance, here you can see we've only got 24 polygons. If we hit D on our keyboard, that'll move up existing subdivision levels. Here we have 96, and here we have 384, 1,536, and then if we were to subdivide again, 6,000. So we can get into the millions and millions of polygons, and that's where you stop sort of seeing the polygons here, and you start just seeing it as a lump of some material, so a lump of clay that you can mold and change the shape of. Okay, and we can again go up and down our subdivision levels. So we have all these different subdivision levels. So if we wanted to, for instance, if we're working with something that's very, fine detail up at level 7, but then we realize, oh, I want to change the overall shape of it, we can always go back down to a lower level, maybe level 3, and make a large scale change to the shape, which is easy to do because there's very few points. And then those changes are reflected in the upper level. So if you had some sort of detail here, you'd be able to see that come through. Okay, and so we're able to move up and down our subdivision levels. Again, just remember each quad is divided into 4 additional quads. Now, one other thing to look at here, if we come down to the bottom level, and let's go ahead and just delete the higher levels. There's this SMT button. This is the Subdivide Smooth modifier. So if we want to subdivide our model, but we don't want to smooth it, we can just turn that button off. And then we can subdivide. And you can see we've still added the polygons, but we haven't smoothed the shape. And so we could divide a couple of times using this, turning this SMT button off. And then when we turn it back on and subdivide again, now we're subdividing based on that earlier level. And so we get more of a hard cube shape versus the sphere shape that we had before. Okay, so you can use that button to your advantage depending on what you want to do for your model when you subdivide it. Now there's another way that we can subdivide models in ZBrush 4R7, which is really cool. And that's more like a traditional 3D subdivision where you're in, let's say you're in Maya and you just hit 3 on your keyboard to do a smooth mesh preview. We can do the same sort of thing in ZBrush. So we don't have to add all the subdivision levels. If we have a model in here that we're working with, and this actually works really well with the ZModeler brush, which we'll talk about later, we can turn on dynamic subdivision. So if we hit dynamic subdivision, we're not adding polygons. We're basically using our base mesh as a cage, and we're subdividing the result. And so we can come in here and say, okay, I want to see it subdivided 5 times. And so we still have the cube. If we turn that off, the cube is still there, but this is what it looks like smooth. So in this case, this isn't about going in and sculpting at different levels and adding detail at different levels. This is about taking a mesh that we've created maybe with a ZModeler or a low-res mesh, and we want to view it, we want to subdivide it just like we would in another application. And so we can use this dynamic subdivision. Okay, now looking at this, we've got 5, we're subdividing it 5 times. We're not going to be sculpting on this mesh, but it's something where we can turn it off and on. Now we can go in and apply it, and now you can see it's actually taken those and created subdivision levels. So we can go back and we can go from one to the other. From dynamic, we can go to our subdivision levels. Okay, or we can just use this dynamic subdivision if we just have a model that we have here and we want to see it smooth. And we do have some settings here that we can change as well based on a grid or again flat subdivision levels versus smooth subdivision levels. So we could say, okay, I want to have a couple of flat subdivision levels, and then I want a couple of smooth subdivision levels. And so that again gives us that same result of turning off that SMT button to just add polygons but don't smooth, and then at some point start to smooth it as well, and that gives you more of your defined cube shape versus more of like a sphere. Okay, and that dynamic subdivision is really cool, and again, as we get into working with the ZModeler, it's going to become more apparent how we can use that, because the ZModeler is a really cool method of creating low-res geometry in ZBrush. Okay, so the next thing I think we want to talk about is kind of the basics of sculpting. We talked about subdividing. Let's talk about, once we've got our model subdivided, what's the best way to go about starting to actually do some sculpting on it? So let's do that next.